The April mud outside Harlan's Creek smelled like something dying, and Wren Calloway had driven 3 days through it to marry a man she'd never met. The letter had been short. 2 children. Wife gone 2 winters past, looking for someone practical, not romantic. The agency in St. Louis had called it an opportunity. Wren had called it the only door still open. She was 28 years old with 43 cents, a carpetbag that had belonged to her mother, and a seamstress's hands that had stopped shaking somewhere around the Kansas border. The shaking wasn't fear exactly. It was what happened when you ran out of choices and had to call it a decision instead. The stage let her off in front of a general store with a porch that sagged on one side like a man favoring a bad leg. The town of Harlan's Creek was the kind of place that had given up, trying to look like more than it was. Dust. False fronts. A saloon that opened before the church. She was looking for someone named Declan Pruitt. He found her first. A wagon pulled up while she was still standing on the porch with her bag at her feet. The man who climbed down from it didn't look like his letter. His letter had been plain and organized, every word where it needed to be. The man himself was too tall for his coat, weathered past his years, and looked at her the way a person looks at something they ordered and aren't sure arrived right. Miss Calloway, not a question. Mr. Pruitt, not a greeting either, really, just confirmation. He picked up her bag before she could and put it in the wagon without asking if she wanted help. She followed because there was nothing else to do. The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour. He said 11 words the entire way. She counted without meaning to. The land around them was wide and flat and February bare, and she watched it pass and told herself this was survivable. She had survived worse. She had survived the dress shop closing, her father's debts, 2 years of her aunt's charity that felt nothing like charity. She could survive a quiet man and a hard winter and starting over. The ranch house was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand, but solid, built to last rather than to impress. 2 children appeared on the porch when the wagon pulled up, a boy about 8 and a girl a year or 2 younger. They looked at Wren with the wary frankness of children who'd learned that new things sometimes hurt. "That's Tobias," Declan said, climbing down, "and Susanna." The girl Susanna had her father's coloring, but her face belonged to someone else entirely, someone softer. Tobias looked like a smaller, more suspicious version of Declan Pruitt, which meant he looked like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Wren climbed down without help and walked up to the porch and crouched to eye level with them both. "I'm Wren," she said. "I'm not here to be your mother. I know you already had one of those. I'm just here to help." Tobias said nothing. Susanna reached out and touched Wren's coat button with one careful finger. That was how it started. She married Declan Pruitt 6 days later in the front room of the ranch house with the circuit preacher and a neighbor woman named Harriet as witness. The ceremony lasted about as long as Wren expected, which was not long at all. Declan said his words like a man signing a contract. Wren said hers like a woman who understood exactly what she was signing. There was no celebration. There was beef stew for supper, and Susanna told her she'd made the biscuits herself, all puffed up with pride about it, and Wren ate too and told her they were the best she'd had in years. That part was even true. The months that followed were hard in the ordinary way that ranch life was hard. She learned the rhythms of the place. Declan up before dawn, back after dark, words rationed like water in a dry year. The children warming to her slowly, Susanna faster, Tobias watching from a careful distance that got shorter week by week. She kept the house. She kept the accounts because it became quickly obvious that Declan was a man who understood cattle and weather and not much else about managing money. The books told a story he hadn't put in his letter. The ranch was in trouble. Not dramatically, not yet, but the way a crack in a wall is trouble before the wall falls. 2 bad seasons. A cattle illness the year before that had taken a third of the herd. Loans from a man in town named Garrett Voss that had seemed manageable at the time, and now sat in the ledgers like a stone. She didn't say anything about it right away. She was still a stranger in the house, still learning which floorboards creaked, and how Declan took his coffee, and what made Susanna cry quietly in the night when she thought no one could hear. But she kept watching the numbers, and the numbers kept getting worse. In June, she brought the ledger to Declan after supper. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at her. "You can read accounts," he said. "I kept books for a dress shop in St. Louis for 4 years. She sat down across the table from him. "You owe Garrett Voss nearly $2,000. When's it due?" "October. What's your plan?" He was quiet in the way he was often quiet, not empty but dense, like something was working in him that didn't show on the surface. "Sell the south pasture if I have to. That's next year's grazing. You do that, and you're short again come spring." She turned the ledger to show him the column she'd been working on. "You've got 340 head right now. If the calf yield holds, you could sell earlier than usual and cover half. The other half needs to come from somewhere else. I know my ranch. I know. She didn't back down from him, just kept her voice level. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying two pairs of eyes on a problem are better than one. He looked at her for a moment, something shifting in his face that she couldn't entirely read. Then he pulled the ledger toward him and started reading more carefully. That was the first time she felt like she might actually fit here. Garrett Voss came to the ranch in August. Wren had seen him in town twice before, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s who dressed too well for Harlan's Creek and carried himself like someone who'd decided long ago that the world owed him accommodation. He had a banker's smile that didn't reach anywhere above his teeth. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when Declan was in the far pasture and not due back until evening. Wren was hanging laundry when she heard the horse. She dried her hands and went to meet him. Mrs. Pruitt. He dismounted without being invited, which told her something. Is your husband about? He'll be back by dark. You're welcome to wait or come back tomorrow. I'll wait. He moved toward the porch without being asked. We have some business to discuss. Perhaps you could send for him. Tobias was watching from the barn door. Wren caught his eye and gave a small nod toward the far pasture. He disappeared. She brought Voss coffee because that was what you did, and she sat in the chair closest to the door and watched him take up space in a way that suggested he owned it already. The October payment, he said, not bothering to ease into it. Mr. Pruitt is aware of the timeline. I'm sure he is. I want to make sure you are as well. Voss smiled at her over the rim of the cup. The note comes due on the 15th. Full amount plus interest accumulated since March. I'm aware of what the note says. Good. He set the cup down. Because I want to make an alternative proposal, and I'd rather Pruitt hear it from you first. Soften the ground, as they say. Wren looked at him and said nothing, which was often the best way to make a man keep talking. The south and east pastures together come to about 400 acres. Good land. I'd be willing to forgive the debt in exchange for the deed to those parcels. That's 600 acres of grazing land. The debt is $2,000. The debt is $2,000 and growing, Mrs. Pruitt. And Pruitt's credit in this county is nearly gone. He can't borrow elsewhere. Voss leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who'd already decided how this conversation ended. My offer is generous. Considering what? Considering that if he defaults in October, I foreclose on the whole property. House, land, all of it. The children would need somewhere to go. He paused just long enough to make sure that landed. I'd rather not see it come to that, so would you, I imagine? Wren sat very still, the way she'd learned to sit when something wanted her to move fast and panic. I'll tell him, she said. Voss rode out 20 minutes before Declan returned. Wren told him everything, word for word, including the part about the children. Declan's face did something complicated and then went still. He stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at nothing. He's been wanting that land since before Eleanor died, he said. Eleanor had been his first wife. He almost never said her name. This was always how he planned to get it. Did you know that when you borrowed from him? I knew he was the only one who'd lend. He turned from the window. I didn't have another choice. Wren understood that kind of no choice better than most. We need to find one now. She found it in the account books she'd been keeping since March, in the careful trail of numbers that most people would have looked at and seen only debt. But Wren had been reading numbers her whole working life, and numbers told stories if you knew how to listen. Voss had been manipulating the interest. It was subtle. A rounding here, a compounding schedule there that didn't match the original terms of the note. She'd seen the original note because Declan had shown it to her early on when she'd first asked about the accounts, and she'd written down the terms in her own ledger without quite knowing why. Habit, maybe. Or something else. The discrepancy wasn't enormous. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was enough. She sat with it for 2 days before she said anything, making sure she hadn't made an error, making sure she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. Then she showed Declan. He stared at the columns for a long time. You're certain? I've checked it 4 times. Voss won't just accept this. He'll say you miscalculated. He can say whatever he wants. The original note is right there in your desk drawer, and my accounting matches its terms exactly. His doesn't. She kept her voice steady. This doesn't make the debt disappear. We still owe the corrected amount by October. But it buys time, and it takes the threat of foreclosure off the table if we fight it properly. Properly means a lawyer. He looked at her. Lawyers cost money. There's a lawyer in Dorado who handled a property dispute for the McCready family 3 years ago. Won it too, against a man twice as connected as Voss. His name is Cyrus Webb. I wrote to him last week. A long silence. You wrote to him last week, Declan repeated. I wasn't sure if I'd found anything real yet. I didn't want to raise your hopes. She waited. I should have told you I was looking. I'm sorry for that part. He was quiet again, that dense working quiet of his. Then, slowly, something in his face shifted. Not softer exactly, more like a wall that had decided to become a door. What did he say? She pulled the reply letter from her apron pocket and put it on the table between them. Garrett Voss did not take it quietly. The week after Declan sent the formal dispute letter through Cyrus Webb, things started happening. A fence line on the east pasture was cut. 3 cattle strayed and weren't found for 2 days. The man Declan had hired on as an extra hand that summer, a steady young man named Bellard, came in one evening looking rattled and gave his notice without explanation. Wren watched all of it and said nothing in town when she went for supplies, but she listened. Harlan's Creek was the kind of small place where silence itself carried information, and she had learned to read it. Voss had friends. The county sheriff was one of them, which she'd suspected from the way the man looked through her when she nodded to him on the street. The justice of the peace was another. Declan had told her that Webb's letter had already been met with a claim that the dispute would be heard by the county court, which meant the county judge, who was a man named Harkins, who had hunted with Voss every fall for 15 years. He owns this county, Declan said one night. He didn't say it with defeat, just with the flatness of someone stating a fact they'd known for a while and never found a way around. He owns this county, Wren agreed. What county borders this one to the east? He looked at her. Territorial court would supersede county, she said. Webb said as much in his last letter. If we can get the case moved to the territorial level, Harkins has no jurisdiction. Voss has connections in the territory too, maybe, but connections thin out the farther they stretch. She had learned this in a different way, running a dead man's debts through a dress shop's books, watching how creditors became polite and reasonable the moment you spoke to someone they didn't own. Cyrus Webb trained under a territorial judge in Santa Fe. He knows people. He can file for a change of venue on grounds of conflict of interest. Declan stared at her the way he sometimes did, like he was recalculating something. My first wife was afraid of her own shadow, he said. Not unkindly, just as if it was something he'd been thinking. That sounds like it was hard, Wren said. It wasn't her fault. He was quiet a moment. I just mean I didn't expect you. She didn't know exactly what to do with that, so she said, should I write to Webb about the venue change? Yes, Declan said. Write to Webb. October came fast. Voss called in the note on the 10th, 5 days early, and sent the county sheriff with the paperwork. The sheriff arrived on a Wednesday morning and had the decency to look somewhat uncomfortable about it. Declan was in the barn. Wren was the one who met him at the door. We have an active legal dispute filed with the territorial court regarding the validity and terms of this note, she said. Mr. Webb's office notified the county court of the stay last week. You're welcome to confirm that before proceeding. The sheriff looked at the papers she held out to him, which were Webb's stay filing, perfectly in order. Voss won't like this, he said. I imagine not. He left. He didn't serve the foreclosure. Voss came himself 3 days later, which Wren had expected. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize, which she hadn't. Declan was there this time. He stood on the porch, and Wren stood beside him, which she'd decided early on was where she belonged in this. You're making this complicated, Voss said from the yard. He didn't bother pretending to be cordial anymore. The banker's smile was gone, and what was underneath it wasn't pleasant. I gave you a fair deal. Now you're bringing lawyers and courts into something that could have been settled quietly. Settled quietly your way, Declan said. He had that flat quiet in his voice that Wren had come to recognize as the edge of something deep and unmovable. The interest adjustment in your accounting doesn't match the original note terms, Wren said. If you believe your figures are correct, you're welcome to prove that in territorial court. Voss looked at her in a way that made clear he'd forgotten. She was someone worth looking at carefully, and now he was revising that. This isn't your business, he said. This ranch is my home. My husband's debt is my concern. The law is relevant to both. She held his gaze. Mr. Webb expects the hearing to be scheduled within 6 weeks. One of the men with Voss moved slightly, a shift of weight that wasn't casual. Declan's hand moved too, very slightly, near the rifle leaning against the porch post. 6 weeks is a long time, Voss said. It is, Wren agreed. You could also simply agree to the corrected interest terms and accept payment on the original schedule. That would resolve everything without a hearing. He looked between them, calculating. Then he turned his horse and left. His men followed. Declan waited until they were gone before he exhaled. He'll try something else, he said. Yes. Wren watched the dust settle, but he has to try it with the territorial court watching now. That changes what he can do. What Voss tried was the children. It came through a woman Wren didn't know. A sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Ord, who arrived with the county welfare officer one November afternoon and announced she was there to assess the fitness of the household. Wren let them in. She made coffee. She answered every question in a voice so calm and reasonable that even the welfare officer seemed confused about why he'd come. The house was clean. The children were healthy, present, and clearly fed. Susanna showed Mrs. Ord her spelling primer and her stitching practice. Tobias was colder about it, but he was 13 and cold about most things. After they left, Wren went to find Declan in the barn. He was standing very still with his hands on a fence rail, jaw set. "I should have seen that coming," he said. "I don't think he had planned it from the start. I think he's running out of angles." She stood beside him in the cold barn smell of hay and horses. He wouldn't have sent a welfare check if the legal challenge wasn't working. If they take Susanna and Tobias, they won't. There was nothing for them to find. She paused. "But we should document. Letters to Webb, a record of this visit and the timing relative to the dispute. If Voss uses county officials to harass us again, we want it on paper." Declan turned to look at her. This close, she could see the exhaustion in him, the weight of 2 winters alone before she came, the weight of debt and bad seasons and losing a wife and trying to hold a ranch together with insufficient everything. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not suspicious. Just genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. "Because it's my home now too," she said. "And because I know what it looks like when someone uses the law like a weapon. I spent 4 years watching a man in St. Louis do it to people who owed him money." She looked at the horses in their stalls, the ordinary solid fact of them. "I'm not going to stand by while it happens to you." He looked at her for a long moment. "To us," he said quietly. She didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened. It had been a long time since anything had. The territorial hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of January. Webb came out to the ranch the week before to prepare. He was a compact, efficient man in his 40s who asked very precise questions and seemed to enjoy the fact that Wren had documentation for everything. "Your accounting is meticulous," he said, going through her ledgers at the kitchen table. "I had a good teacher." Her old employer in St. Louis had been particular about numbers. She'd hated him most days, but was grateful for it now. "Voss is going to argue that you introduced the discrepancy yourself, that the original note said what he claims. The original note is in my husband's desk, signed and witnessed. He'll say it's a forgery. Then he'll have to explain why the paper and ink are 5 years old, and why the witness is a woman who died 3 years ago, and left written records that match the amounts in my ledger exactly." She had found that connection 2 weeks ago. In the old county deed filings, the same witness, who'd signed the note, had filed a property deed the same year that referenced the Pruitt loan amount in the attached accounting. "I can show you." Webb looked at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Pruitt, have you considered the law as a profession?" "I considered a lot of things," she said. "I ended up here." The hearing was held in Dorado at the Territorial Courthouse, a brick building that smelled like old paper and authority. Wren sat in the gallery with Susanna pressed close against her side. Declan was at the table with Webb. Voss was across the aisle with a lawyer from the Capitol, who had the look of a man who charged by the syllable. Wren watched the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap, and she was afraid the whole time. Afraid in the particular way, she was afraid of things she'd worked hard for, and could still lose. But she didn't show it. And after a while Susanna reached over and held her hand like she was the one doing the comforting, which she was. Webb presented the case methodically. The original note, her ledger, the deed filing cross-reference, the timeline of Voss's actions after the dispute was filed, the welfare visit. Voss's lawyer argued forgery, arithmetical error, marital interference. He used the phrase a woman's amateur accounting, and the judge looked at him with an expression Wren filed away for later. It took 2 days. The ruling came on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The territorial judge found in favor of the corrected interest terms. Voss was ordered to accept payment on the original schedule. The foreclosure proceedings were dismissed. The welfare visit was formally noted as potentially retaliatory. Voss left the courthouse without looking at either of them. Outside in the cold January air, Susanna hugged Wren so hard around the middle that she nearly lost her balance. Tobias stood back, but when Wren looked at him, he gave her a small nod. From Tobias she had learned, that was considerable. Declan stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment, looking up the street. "It's not over," he said finally. "Men like Voss don't stop." "No," she agreed, "but he's going to have to try something that doesn't involve the county court. That narrows his options considerably." He looked at her sideways. "You're not worried. I'm always worried." She watched Susanna spin in a small happy circle on the courthouse steps. "I just don't let it make my decisions for me." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Spring came the way it always did in that country, suddenly and without much apology. The calves came in strong numbers. The fence lines that had been cut were repaired and stayed repaired. Bellard came back, hat in hand, and said Voss had paid him to quit and he was sorry for it. Declan rehired him without much fuss. Wren planted a kitchen garden. She taught Susanna to keep simple accounts, to understand what the numbers in a ledger meant and why it mattered. Tobias, who she had been most uncertain of, came to her one evening with a broken harness, and asked if she knew how to stitch leather. She didn't, but she figured it out alongside him. And after that, something between them settled into something easier. She wrote to her cousin in Missouri, the first letter she'd sent to anyone from her old life, and said simply that she was well and the address was permanent. Voss made one more attempt in April. He filed a complaint through a business partner, claiming a prior claim on the water rights for the East Pasture. Webb handled it in 6 weeks. The claim was baseless, and everyone, including the judge, seemed to know it. After that, the silence from Voss settled into something that felt less like threat and more like acceptance. "I think he's moved on," Declan said one evening. They were on the porch after supper, the light going gold over the flat land. Maybe. Wren had the week's accounts in her lap but wasn't looking at them. Or he found an easier target. Does that bother you? That he just found something else. She thought about it. A year ago, she might have wanted something more dramatic, punishment, vindication, some visible proof that the right thing had won. "Not really," she said. "I wanted the ranch safe." "It's safe." She looked out at the land, the long gold grass, the cattle moving slow in the distance. That was the point. Declan was quiet for a while. He was often quiet, but she'd learned the different weights of it. This one was the working kind. "I wrote a bad letter," he said finally. "The advertisement. What I sent the agency. I thought it was honest. It was too short, didn't say enough." He didn't look at her, just kept looking at the land. "Should have said I was looking for someone to build something with, not just someone to manage the house." Wren set the accounts aside. "It said practical," she said. Practical turned out to be enough. He turned to look at her then, and she looked back, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Inside, she could hear Susanna reading aloud to Tobias. Some story she'd found in the school primer, her voice stumbling over the longer words. Tobias kept correcting her, patient in a way he wasn't patient about most things. Wren listened to that for a moment. Then she picked up the accounts again, because the numbers wouldn't read themselves, and the lands stretched out around the house, wide and indifferent, and hers now in every way that mattered.